Well, that's what I was hoping they would do. They seem to think that this is still work. Hopefully people will gravitate in as they get more and more inebriated.
It's the best way to talk about security.
Is that his? It might be his.
Let's pull one of the doors closed maybe, or maybe even both of them.
What's that?
How much should we spend?
Maybe try and leave one if we can. But okay, well, welcome. We got a few people, and hopefully we'll get a few more. We got people out there. So this is an informal session. Yeah, unless you're Lutherans, you should move forward. The Lutherans can stay in the back of the church if they want to. But we have a lot of Lutherans here.
Yeah,
You do.
Anyway, so I'm Bill Estrom, and I think I'd like to introduce our panel. And where'd my little thing go here? I've got
I got it
everybody's
here.
names. So Rob Raymer, and he works over at U.S. Bank as a security architect, and has also got a pretty considerable background working with Arete and with several other companies doing security, and also has run his own security consulting practice. And then Bob Bennett has his own consulting firm as well, and has also got an extensive background with over 15 years of work in information security. And then Jim Hietala is the Vice President of Security as well as Healthcare at the Open Group. So that's like two forums that he's in charge of. And the Security Forum lately has been doing a lot of work with the development of standards on risk management, the Open Fair standard, and they're working on some other projects that I think you're going to find pretty intriguing. I don't know how much you can say about all that work right now, but...
At least a little.
A little bit?
Get into
Okay.
it, yeah.
So yeah, let me go ahead and just let you each maybe say a little bit more about what you're doing, and then we'll go ahead and start on the questions. So Bob, why don't you go ahead and start out?
Sure. So my name is Bob Bennett. We just started Navalogic earlier this year. I have been on the consulting side, recently, let's say. Coming from the practitioner side, being a practitioner for about 10 years and being a consultant even before that. Originally came from an engineering background and a little bit of software development, and that's how I have extended my career a little bit into a couple different areas. So certainly architecture is very important, and getting security into business processes. Just not enough can be said about making that happen to be effective, as we all know if you've been listening to the news.
Great. Rob, go ahead.
like Bob, I'd been in consulting for quite a while, looking at security from, in a sense, the outside. In the last couple of years, I've been at the bank, U.S. Bank, and looking at where it's really, partly it's a business issue, partly it's a technical issue, and partly it's a political issue, and the bank, fortunately, at the top, they really get it, and they're sort of forced to get it because how heavily regulated banking industry is. So they're very supportive of security, and I think but even that said, there's so many different partners, and so in some ways, probably the political side is the hardest, and to me, the key thing is risk management, which, you guys are trying to figure out metrics and standards, and really, that's important work.
Yep.
Jim, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm responsible for security and healthcare at the Open Group. On the security side, we have three really active areas. One is information security management. The second is security architecture, so that intersection of TOGAF and security and risk. And then the third is risk management. And basically, the way that we operate at the Open Group, we bring customer organizations and vendors together. We work on standards and best practices that are of interest to our members. They define the work program. The members do much of the work in building the standards and best practices. The staff facilitate the work. We publish standards and best practices. And then where appropriate, we'll also build certification programs for people or for products or processes to help drive the standards into the market. So some of the more recent things we've been doing, we standardized FAIR, if you're familiar with that, the Factor Analysis of Information Risk, a popular risk analysis methodology. that we call Open Fair in the Open Group. We published a couple of standards with that, as well as a certification program for risk analysts. And we're actively doing work to bring security and risk thinking into TOGAF in a more fundamental way. So in future versions of TOGAF that the Open Group is looking to produce, you'll see security and risk being more central to the effort.
So I put on here in the conference brochure some questions that I wanted to kind of just structure the discussion, and I'll start going through these. But I think also we want this session. This is a bird of a feather session, which is a little different from the normal kind of speeches and things like that. So if we sense that there are questions in the audience that are maybe higher precedence, we'll kind of try and switch over to that. And so I think we got a great panel here that's pretty flexible. And so I said, first of all, is security a business issue or a technical issue? And I heard some things, I think Rob mentioned in his remarks, that definitely it's a business and it's a human issue as well. So I'm working for a bank. I'm always tempted to ask, why do people rob banks? Who was it that said that? Was that Dillinger or something like that? Because that's where the money is. So yeah, so that's certainly an issue today. But we've also seen other reasons why people are doing attacks against other companies, but they're usually motivated by some kind of financial gain that they're hoping to get. But sometimes it's just malicious. So yeah. And then I say here, can architects build security capabilities into their plans? So as we were planning for this event, we got all these proposals from people for papers that they wanted to present, and we came up with our final slate of the track speakers for the thing, and I looked at it and I said, wow, this looks fabulous. And then as I looked at it harder and harder, I realized there wasn't a single paper that had been presented for inclusion or that had been selected that dealt with information risk and security. And I think this is a common problem. It seems like security is, for some reason, an afterthought, and I think sometimes it's because it's hard and people don't really understand it, and other people just get so excited with the heat of the moment when they're building some application or whatever that they just kind of forget. And so how can we build security into the security architecture? How can we get other types of planners, architects, and others to spend a little bit more time thinking about how they can design their systems so that they're secure all the way from the top to the bottom, from the business all the way down to the infrastructure. I'll turn that one loose once you guys talk about it.
I can jump in. In terms of making security more pervasive in what we're doing in architecture, at least from the TOGAF perspective, I think it means like striping security and risk throughout the ADM. So when you're working through the ADM and building your architecture, that there's steps along the way that relate to security and risk so that you're thinking about it at each stage. So the work that I alluded to before really is about that. It's introducing security thinking into the EA development process.
So for those of you that aren't familiar with TOGAF as an architecture framework, in the current version, TOGAF 9 and 9.1, we do have a chapter on security, which is a big improvement over TOGAF 8, which it was a white paper you could download off of the web if you wanted to. So in TOGAF 9, we put a good chapter in, which is based on NIST 80,000 series, but it's still kind of a layer that's been put on top of the architecture framework. So the things that Jim's talking about is a deeper integration so that explicit steps will be called out as you go through the architecture development method, which is the process that we use in TOGAF for designing architectures.
To me, a lot of it is you sort of look at transportation or the automobile industry and, the old kind of adage that, the reason people put brakes on a car isn't to make it stop, but to allow cars to go faster, and better brakes makes it you can go faster. But it's not just brakes, because people love to think of the security group as the one who put the brakes on a project, but it's really more of an analogy of safety these days, which is, again, now only stupid people rob banks because all you can get is a couple $1,000s. You hack into a system and steal 70 million credit cards. I mean, it's peanuts. So really, if we can I think a lot of it really is that education of the business side as well as IT developers, architects, that, okay, it's really a safety issue for your customers. It's not, just a bunch of stupid compliance rules,
And adding on to that, I'd say, I'm sorry.
I was going to say, just as a follow-up, I understand in general your statement. Where are we as business and as architects along that spectrum of starting to understand? I still have the sense that we're babes in the woods, but maybe I'm wrong. Your opinion.
My opinion is, we're still babes in the woods. In a sense, we're like the insurance industry was in the 1800s when, they were trying to sell this idea of like, you give me money now in case, your crops are wiped out by a hailstorm. They're like, yeah, right. Why should I give you money?
Yeah, and to add on and then pick up from there, if you look at information security as an industry, it really came around when 90. I know it really started in 96, but when did it start to get big? 98 up to 2000, and that's about when I started. Why do I only have 15 years? Well, that's why, right? Because I came from a development to an infrastructure group, right? So yes, we are. When you throw into that our models, right, for security, it was real easy when it was back to a firewall. That network boundary of a firewall, well, it's still there, but it sure has changed, hasn't it? And now you've got cloud computing. You had service-oriented architecture along the way, which was great because then you had a model you could use, right? But what I want to challenge is, how many of you are talking to your security people? Got one, two. Do you have you taken those models, and even if you haven't adopted, and Jim, the Open Group's done great work, if you can't adopt the whole model, start. Right? Bring your security people out of the security technology, understand what they're doing, and also feed them information of what you know from the business to build that model that works for your organization. But start somewhere, take an iterative approach and say, what are the big fundamental things we've got to do? What are the foundational things that we have to get, right? Start there. Because what it's still about, and I'd say, it's not just about customers. It's about your business, because we all know, you've seen it all in the news now, right? So it's about your business as well. What works for your business? And are you progressing? You got to start somewhere. And I think to tie up that thought, I think it was Jeff who said, culture. What is your culture? What do you make your culture? Are you going to cross that boundary because you've got, your group's over here, security's looking this way. Somebody's got to bridge that gap.
We hear the same thing about enterprise architecture, though, that it's kind of a barrier to getting things done. It's a process step that you have to go through. Go ahead, we have a question over here. TJ.
Yeah, in the context that you're just speaking, how do you define culture? Inherently in the IT industry, we are ambiguous in our use of terminology and everything else. I'd like to hear how you're defining culture in that context.
Well, your company culture in this context, and let's say it's even within IT, between those two groups. If your IT architecture team, not just a business architecture group, and your security team aren't talking, that comes from your head of IT. That's one culture. If your business culture allows you to cross those groups, you have cross-functional efforts. And your culture is, I'm going functional on you, right? What does your culture allow you to do? Does it encourage that engagement, or is it very siloed?
But in its essence, culture is learned behavior, right?
Learned behavior and habits that are reinforced by management mores, So, in certain sense, one of the cultures we have to fight at the bank is, sort of audit fetishism, or, what you worry about. You fight against getting an audit finding. Well, wait a minute. At the same time, you're trying to avoid getting a finding because we're not scanning or we're not monitoring in appropriate depth. We're complaining to our managers that we don't have the funding to monitor in appropriate depth. Well, shoot, auditors are your friends there, even though they're not nice friends, they can help you,
It depends on your audit group, right? Some audit groups are really about the risk, and some are, still feel that you have to come up with findings. So that's why I say you can have different siloed cultures that roll up into another culture, and you may be able to challenge that. Yeah. And personally, you may also have to step out of your comfort zone. When you take a security person who has to respond to an audit, they're going to shut down on you. Like, don't find one more thing that the auditors can come up with. Guess what they're focused on? Just stay away. Don't talk to me, right? You got to pull people out of that.
So TJ and I both, TJ asked a question here a minute ago. We are both alumni of 3M, and I think the culture and that whole environment at 3M was more risk-oriented and permissive of risk-taking than you might find at, for example, U.S. Bank, where they're trying to figure out how to keep people from taking the money. So I think that's kind of the cultural dynamic, although 3M had pretty good security too, but I was always trying to poke holes in the firewall, and they wouldn't let me, so that kind of stuff was definitely being watched, but within boundaries. They weren't quite as conservative as they might have been in other ways. So I think it depends on the type of corporation. And maybe it also depends on where you live. I think maybe regions of the United States, for example, or different parts of the world might have different attitudes about security and in their cultures. And so I think if you're a global company, that's something you definitely have to think about.
I think in the security world, you've also got the issue of the compliance culture versus a true risk-based culture. So much of financial institutions, no end of things that you have to do that GLBA and the FFIEC, sort of dictate through their regulatory agencies. Retailers, they've got the PCI DSS checklist, and I don't know how many specific requirements right now. It's probably 200 at least across 12 areas. And I think companies that get caught up in here's the things we have to do probably don't have the time, budget, et cetera, to really take a risk-based approach a lot of times to say, where do we really have risk? Where do we need to mitigate it, whether it's on this checklist or not? So you've got that tension between what regulators are telling you have to do and what a real risk-based approach would tell you for the business. This is what makes sense based upon the risks that we actually see. So, not an easy answer as to how to deal with that, but it's a reality for businesses today.
You have to make some prioritizations. I like to think about like Hurricane Katrina, and the Corps of Engineers probably could have spent more money on reinforcing the dikes in the 9th District, but instead they didn't, and when the storm came through, it probably would have just been a bad storm if not for the fact that levee gave way and flooded the entire 9th Ward and other parts of the city, and we had 1,000 people that died as a result. So, I think risk management is all about, trying to figure out what is the level of risk we face, what is the magnitude of the risk, and what is the potential frequency and things like that, and it's a trade-off that you have to make. So, you could protect yourself against all conceivable risk, but you wouldn't have any money left to do it. So.
Yeah. I would like to extend on the comment which was made, risk versus compliance. I know that last 15 years there were a lot of compliance and people do go and audit and control check and see that everything is on the line and apparently pay tremendous amount of money for things like RBAC on the company. And still we see those break through the security. I'm sure Target and other company had all the hundreds or so checks apply and still were target. How many you see companies shift and completely apply new philosophy when it's risk-based versus control-based?
Yeah, I can't say I have direct experience seeing companies that are, making that real shift. They're companies that have PCI DSS requirements. If they want to keep processing credit cards, they have to go through and implement all those controls and, get their annual, report on compliance. And so, I think the smart ones, certainly the ones that have been breached, I would think would maybe be rethinking just doing that as a minimum baseline and saying, what else is there that, that we need to understand the risk from and go out and implement other controls to mitigate against or, find a way to transfer the risk or whatever the case may be. So actually, so one example, I know in the hotel industry, there's a consortia that we support to some degree in the Open Group called the Next Generation Hotel Consortia, I think it is. And we had a presentation from one of their architects at one of our conferences, and he outlined their whole strategy, which is move the credit card processing out of their data centers into other data centers. I mean, they effectively were saying we're going to get out of the PCI compliance business by completely shifting the way that we deal with credit cards. So, you know, a real reaction to the risks of being in that business. So, and you know, I don't have enough experience with other sectors, but you may see other sectors doing that as well, given the, you know, the what's at stake.
How many of you are working in the area of security? How many security people have you got? Okay, so others are other types of architects. So how do you see security fitting in your environment?
Not very well.
Oh, we know that.
A lot of requirements and a lot of checkboxes.
Yeah.
So what you're seeing with that is a direct result of that's where the pressure is. But if you go back to it, you talk about an RBAC model. Why? Why did that ever come about? Because it's still about the data. That's what's valuable. We know that. The records are valuable. Of course, now that there have been so many credit cards hacked, right, it's not as valuable as it used to be, so look out for the next target. That's why they say your healthcare records, right? It's still about getting the right people access to the data and stopping everyone else. But if you're so focused on that operational mode, how do you know when there's outliers? And those are what you respond to. So there's been a lot of conversation. I'd say not many of our clients, but a couple have have moved their programs very dynamically, very quickly with the right staff where they are focusing on those outliers, focusing more on fraud, focusing on detecting anomalies. And so this is where architecture comes in, is that you've got models, you've got designs on how to fit things in. Get good at those, so you spend your resources not on operating, but on looking on the outliers and making sure that you are still doing those business relevant tasks with the resources you have.
And I think sorry, just to follow up quickly, but on the risk versus compliance, that's the kind of the key, you know, and as individual architects on individual systems, if you work for big companies, you can't necessarily have an impact on everything, but it really is about, you know, kind of what's your crown jewels and who has access to it, you know. And so you kind of focus on your piece of the pie and certainly the, you know, the supply chain, you know, where could people break in to attack what's most important in your system.
I was just going to comment, you'd kicked off early security architecture being an afterthought in a way of a lot of our businesses operate. And a lot of the conversation thus far has seemed to focus on, I think, the stereotypical thought that comes to mind when we think of security architecture is that it's the defense. I can't help but be fascinated by one of the comments that you made, Rob, about how breaks enable us to go faster. And I would ask you if you have experience using security architecture and how good or poor your organizations are at it as an offensive strategy. And I guess one example I can think of is not being in security architecture, but spending a lot more of my time in business architecture, enterprise architecture areas, information architecture. I have a group that's very averse to some of the new emerging technologies. For example, cloud just freaks them out. I won't go anywhere with that. I'm relatively confident in my DMZ and my turrets. Is there a way to start to use security architecture concepts as a way to encourage those businesses to act offensively, to move forward and embrace some of these things? Just invite any comments along those lines.
Jim, could you say something about our friend John Sherwood and the stuff that he's been doing with the SABSA architecture and kind of how he handles risk as opposed to some of the other kind of threat-based models?
Yeah, so the SABSA Institute, if you're familiar with them, and the SABSA methodology, their view of risk is, you know, I think the traditional security view of risk is, well, it's something negative, something to be stamped out, and let's get rid of it wherever we can. The SABSA We did some work with them a couple of years ago to write a white paper saying, here's how you can use SABSA with TOGAF. And we're actually continuing to work with them to bring some of their thinking into some of our future security architecture work. But to cut a long story short, they basically have a view of risk that embraces that you take a risk for a business advantage, as well as there's a downside to risk that you have to worry about, but it's a more balanced view, and I think it's more synonymous with the way that architects think about doing projects for the business to, make us more agile, for business advantage, et cetera. So, it's a key cornerstone in the SABSA methodology, and we're embracing it in our work too.
So could that be a model for you with your security team? And that's where I say is take those models, put a useful, stand up your straw man, because that's what I've done before with architects as a security architect myself, is we built those models. And again, it's about who's coming in to access what data, no matter where it is. When you set up those models, then you just have to facilitate that as an offensive strategy. You enable the business.
Right, and I think it's, I really didn't come here to plug U.S. Bank, but one of the, more offensive or the positive side of risk, I think, is an example is their, smartphone banking, and, where they can now, you can take a picture of your check and deposit it. So that's like a business advantage. And, one of the recent surveys said that, people are most skeptical of security on smartphones. And there are huge risks there, but at the same time, there's also huge risks everywhere else. And most of the biggest breaks have been failures of really kind of basic controls. People originally got in to Target and these other places because of unpatched servers. And how old is that? It's not the latest, iOS vulnerability that they used. It was an old Windows Server vulnerability that nobody patched,
Well, I also, just my perspective as a consumer, forgetting about what I do as a day job, with all the breaches and all the hacks and the number of letters that I get saying, hey, sorry, but your credit card's been breached. We're going to send you a new one and don't use your current one, I think we're getting to almost a tipping point where, the first bank that comes out and really looks to me like they have a bulletproof system for the cards that they issue, it's going to become a competitive differentiator for that financial institution. And I think, as well as credit card companies. And so I think, maybe the consciousness, I don't know how you all think, I'd be interested in your thoughts on that too, but I think the consciousness is changing when security keeps showing up day after day in the USA Today. It's not limited to the trade press anymore. It's part of daily life, and maybe there'll be a mindset shift to where it actually is something that people look for when they're going and shopping for a bank or whatever.
Make one other comment on that. The security team you're working with may feel a lot of ownership, right? And so they feel it's their responsibility to make it airtight before anything can happen. But do they own the risk? Do they own that decision? And this is where I think as a lot of folks, and whether you call it the old school of information security versus the new school, is quantify that for me. Use a model like FAIR, which has been proven to be about the best one to put out there. Know the value of the data. Know the risk. Give me some real scenarios of what can happen and how likely it is. Give me evidence behind it. And present that so you can say, this is the best I can do. We spend this much. I can mitigate it to this point, and let somebody else make the decision. It's not ours to own. We don't own the business.
Right. And challenge your security people. I mean, most of you aren't in security. Challenge them. Yeah, sure, they don't want to open up this hole in the firewall, but what's the risk? How do they define risk? Which gets back to culture and, how do you change to risk-based versus compliance-based? It's going to have to come from the top, but it can come from the bottom too, that we can try to say, well, and we're facing that, is that we're fighting with some of the auditors are very checkbox compliance based, and it's like, how do you define risk? Well, when you fail one of our audits, that's what's the real risk to the corporation, positive or negative,
So this brings us back to the first question: is security a business issue or a technical issue? So you guys are good at the technical countermeasures, but at the end of the day, isn't it really management's obligation to make some of these big decisions about how much to spend on risk? And why is it that American banks are still using magnetic stripe technology when many other countries are now using smart card chips and things like that? I know that we're starting to use them here, but it's in its infancy compared to like when I go to Europe or even Canada. They've got smart cards which are a lot more intelligent and a lot more resistant to attack. Not that they're bulletproof. And now we have the Apple Pay system coming out, and I don't know if that's going to be the ultimate solution, but it looks like they've kind of, like you said, sidestepped some of the issues related to PCI compliance, because we're not dealing with mag stripes anymore. We're dealing with onboard stored information that is then only given out as one-time card numbers, and they can only be used once. So then the problem of people intercepting your transmission with a skimmer or something like that becomes less of a threat, much less. So that's, again, a business issue. For example, how many of these local merchants are thinking about adopting Apple Pay? I think a lot of people are going to, just like they did with smart cards, are going to sit on the sidelines and kind of wait to see what their competitors do and what the consumers want and things like that. Go ahead.
Maybe to change the track from financial to something else. I've seen it in the news past month or so, a lot of medical device companies in the Twin Cities, and the deal is, what about hacking the radio frequency on whoever's got the pacemaker? I can beep a button and cause you to drop right there. And Dick Cheney had a custom-made pacemaker. The strategy used by the device companies always was they would use a real obscure networking communication protocol to and from that device. And they'd say, for anybody to figure that out, say, MIT or Harvard or somebody, the grad students who had nothing to do, figured it out and they published it. And that created the whole brouhaha. That gets to the matter of expense versus effort versus secure control. What they were doing is basically hiding in plain sight. I don't know what my question is, but I throw that out as a new and different discussion topic.
Run with it. Yeah.
I mean, that can be a legitimate strategy, I think. I mean, there are companies that will stand up dummy servers by the hundreds as just to obscure the fact that there's one that's got some value in there. I mean, that can be a way to deal with things, but I think in terms of medical devices, there's a whole host of other issues around those things that, from a security standpoint, serious issues. So, I mean, I was in a doctor's office the other day, and you look on the screen, and it's a version of Windows that's so old you're embarrassed to even still go to that doctor, right? I mean, it's like, and the unpatched. Well, actually, my physician had no electronic medical records. He just went out of business because he was tired of dealing with the paperwork hassles. But I left with my medical record. It was about that thick, it was like on paper.
You must be healthy. That's not very good.
Yeah. But I mean, the medical industry security issues are vast, and it starts with those clinical devices having really old embedded operating systems frequently. They can't patch them with the same frequency that IT devices get patched. And they're caught in this cycle of, it's a no-win cycle for a lot of those things.
When we were in Amsterdam doing the open fair class a while back, one of the students said that they were from one of the state healthcare organizations, and they were really intensely interested in this because what they were concerned about wasn't the fact that they might disclose something through their systems, but the fact that they had quite a few service providers out there that were providing healthcare services who had the possibility of either negligently or deliberately disclosing healthcare information. And as a contractor, they weren't even, other than the fact that they'd never get business from that state again, they have no real means of necessarily policing issues like that. It's a consequence that rolls back to the government, makes them look bad, so they know that there's a PR exposure there. So on one hand, they're looking at things that are very symmetrical to the kind of threat that they have identified. On the other side of the world, we're now working over on a project at the VA, and we get handed laptops, and the first story is that we got a laptop and all these ID things and all these things that have to do with the badges that we carry, all due to the fact that some guy lost a laptop on a train a number of years ago. My USB ports are locked down, and when I came to this website to register for this was considered an unclassified website, so they wouldn't allow me to proceed through to the site. There's a wildly asymmetrical response to these kinds of things.
Knee-jerk.
We have a retailer, an organization in town that I went in to do a proctor of an exam at, and we sat down, and the first thing they said was things have changed substantially. We can get you on the network. You can log into this SSID. I say, I don't see it. They say, oh, yeah, but it's hidden. Go ahead, just put it in your thing. And then I say, how do I log in? And they say, well, we have to make you a user. How do you do that? Well, we email it to you. Okay, that's interesting. How do I do that if I can't log in? So we worked that around, and it was one thing after another after another. Every single thing that could possibly be locked down in their environment, just like over at the VA, was done because there seemed to have been a complete sea change in terms of their attitude about security that said if it can be turned off or unlocked or locked up or disconnected, it must be. And so that became the default for every single aspect in security in the organization, even despite the fact that if you read the trade papers, you kind of know that the exploits in both cases had nothing to do with all these things that have been done to lock the place up.
But Jim, the laptop that was lost held a database with all the Social Security numbers for all veterans. That's what the big deal was, and it happened more than once. So it might have been a knee-jerk response, but they had to do something to try and they probably didn't close the door totally, but yeah.
Yeah, and that's not the only example of something like that, right? With something being lost on a laptop. And now if you look at the recent breaches, and when you are getting more board visibility and a CEO loses his job, as do those under him, the push is, this better not happen to me. So the first reaction is, okay, stop, right? Okay, this goes back to your security as a, as the no guys, not how do I enable this? Give me options. What's really important, and this is where, I'd encourage all architects, this is why we've got to work together a little more and nail it down to what are those key things we've got to do from a security perspective? What are the key things from a business enablement? And what level of risk for these things are you willing to accept? And somebody's got to sign at that at the right level. Do even a lot of organizations know at what level that is? And for what things? But I mean, when you're being called to account for, yeah, you can understand why you go to that length off the bat.
Once you're there, you get locked up. Once the pendulum goes there, it gets locked, and that's kind of disappointing because cooler heads need to prevail. You have to be able to take a more practical attitude to things. There's a guy over at Verizon, Peter Tippett, who was one of those first guys that did stuff related to security and antivirus. And the way he would explain it to people is, in epidemiology, you tell people, why don't you move the toilets to the other side of the road from the drinking water instead of giving people all these antibiotics? They'd probably get less cholera. There are things that you think you need to do, you think you need to inoculate, you think you need to medicate, and you don't really need to do that. There are things that you can do in the environment that actually change the exposures. And we're going away from that. We're going to literally just doing everything that can possibly be done without any idea whether or not it has any value or any effect.
Right, and that's the whole risk versus compliance. And I think we really have to struggle with that. And I think that's part of the immaturity of the industry is that, you get hit, you protect everything, and it's, Ebola, really, we totally try to isolate. Actually, I have a crazy relative, and he had a better solution. He's just, oh, we'll just go and drop a nuclear bomb on West Africa. That'll kill. It's like, no, it's got to be risk-based.
Yes, we overreact sometimes. Well, that brings us to that fourth question here. How do we know how much we should spend to defend the organization assets in an increasingly complex threat landscape? So, yeah, this is all, and it's getting worse. It's not getting any better. So think about going back to the idea of a bank, though. It seems like I've had my credit card, captured and used for like small purchases and things like that. And I think the banks have kind of figured out, well, we'll just reimburse the customer for the loss. And yeah, they might lose their identity, but that's not our problem. And so there's no liability on the bank side. It's like the consumer winds up bearing the burden. So could we change through some regulation so that the bank actually did have more obligation and more liability in the case of a breach than just to say, oh, sorry, we'll give you a new credit card and cover your loss for that $50 Starbucks charge or whatever. So what do you think about that? How can we change that kind of parameter so that, and I think there was a question also over here, wasn't there? Go ahead, question. And then we'll come back to that one. So.
My question was, you mentioned that at the beginning that you need to know what people should have access to, what system or data. Now, when we start having this Internet of Things which become real, and there are completely different things to access data, not by human but by computer, do you see a big change in the security approach?
Okay, go ahead.
There's got to be a change in the approach, but you're still trying to accomplish the same thing. It's just a slightly different model, right? And now what you've done is, in that case with cloud computing, you've extended that model to another party. So, go back to the whole idea with the medical devices. Look at HIPAA. What is happening now is it's not just your responsibility, but you have to look downstream and have those assurances of that model as well. So is it changing? Yes, but is it the same issue for a large part? Yes, it is. So, it should correlate. We're inventing new things, but the same models generally hold true. It shouldn't be rocket science, just apply the same concepts.
Yeah, and it's the data, Internet of Things. Do we care, like a refrigerator that will tell you, hey, you're almost out of milk? Well, I don't care if that's exposed, but if I've got a pacemaker, I care about, somebody who doesn't like me being able to tweak my rhythm.
But not necessarily, because, like I heard, refrigerator send millions of email. It can be malignant and doing some harm to other things, even so it's not a human being who sent this information. So I think it's the different way to communicate or send. For example, OPC, we have this like protection, and we run it every time to make sure that nothing gets to our PC. But in a refrigerator, why in the world I would think that my refrigerator needs some protection? And how I will protect it even if I know that?
The Internet of Things, I think it's very, very early days in even thinking about what can go wrong from a security standpoint, and we'll have more refrigerators, sending mass emails, stories coming out, right? And there will be. Next time it'll be a toaster. But I think the point is that many of the manufacturers of those devices, the people who are sticking an IP connection onto them, aren't necessarily thinking through all the bad things that can happen to them. And you also have to think about, are we going to be able to put an anti-malware client on our toaster and our refrigerator? Who's going to patch it when somebody realizes that, hey, there was 20,000 of them we shipped last year have a fault in them, a bug, something that there's all sorts of issues that I think have to be thought through across many, the Internet of Things is not just the consumer bits, but it's all sorts of industrial systems that are going to be just plugged right into the Internet as well. So to me, there's a whole set of issues that we're going to encounter the hard way, like we always do in security when some bad things happen, and then people realize, oops, there's a problem here that has to get solved. So.
Any other comments? Go ahead, TJ.
Yeah, I was kind of wondering, Bill had made a comment earlier about the responsibility and really the liability for security really lies on the business. I'm just curious, I'd like to find out from the panel and really the people in here, how many people that are security architects in the security field are actually giving regular briefings to the business leadership in the organization. I'd just kind of like to hear that from you guys.
Not many. And I'd say the ones who are driving it are going to their boards and giving presentations and educating, and that's how the conversation's starting. Those are the ones that are effective at this point, because otherwise they don't know how to talk about it. What are the metrics that are actually valuable? What are we trying to protect? It's not happening enough, which is why I always say challenge, Rob said it, challenge your security people. Right? Go talk to them. Give them some of the business knowledge. Remind them they don't own the decision. Get some options out there. What are the critical things we have to do? And there's got to be, and Jim, you're talking about risk. Well, what is the reward on those things? Why are we not protecting the credit cards more? Well, what did Target find out when they ran with the chips, right? People didn't like it. So they're not going to use their card. Well, how much money are they going to invest in it versus how much it costs them? Well, a little different scenario now on how much it costs them, but previous to that, how expensive is it to throw a couple of cards back out at people? You got to be able to weigh those out.
Gets back to your question about regulation, and here for sure I'm giving my own opinion and not U.S. Bank, but I mean to me it's like the again going back to transportation or traffic. It's some things the market just is fantastic, and some things it doesn't work. I mean, if we just let the market decide how fast people could drive or whether they could turn on red or not, you'd have traffic like Bombay or Rome or something, And in India, 1 million people a year die from traffic accidents, It's crazy. So, I mean, I think to a certain extent, we have to have rules of the road on the internet and security.
There's got to be like a baseline criteria that you can at least have the basic set of protection.
Yeah.
So back to my question.
Yeah.
Are
How
any
secure
of
are we,
you guys
TJ?
giving briefings to your business leadership?
When business leadership says how secure are we, do they know what they're really looking for?
But you could educate and inform them. These are the risks that we're seeing. You guys should know this, and some options are A, B, C, or D.
And that's what I mean. And when I talk about you've got two silos and there's a gap in between, you got to come together. One group has to start at least, right? And you've got to close that. So if your executives don't know what to look for, well, start the conversation with some of the things you think, get that feedback. But how many are getting briefings? Very few. You got to be at the table to get those briefings. You've got to go out and look for people, and I think that's been a challenge for security professionals. The ones that are succeeding are the ones that are going out and doing that.
I think a lot of it. Excuse me, Rob. I think a lot of it comes down to the point that was made earlier about influence, right? If you have some influence and you can get into the board meeting and you can make that presentation, that works really well. But if you are lacking influence and you keep getting bumped from the board meeting, it's not going to happen, and you're not going to start that conversation.
But it goes back to also regulation. I mean, again, I've only worked at U.S. Bank, but I suspect it's similar at other banks, is that our CISO, even though he's like 3 or 4 levels down, he talks to the chairman. The chairman will call him up and say what's going on, because, if there's an OCC finding, it goes on the U.S., all the stock analysts, they're looking at that. The government is regulating very closely the banks, and it's having a market effect, so the CEO pays attention,
So let's hope that initiates more of those conversations, and we're up to the challenge.
Yeah. Well, we do have COBIT, the COBIT framework, Control Objectives for IT, from the IT Governance Institute and ISACA. They often work with the security architects in an organization and with the internal auditors. And those internal auditors do have the ability to go straight to the chairman of the company and report if they discover anything that they think is fishy. And so in that way, they are communicating with top management.
Direct communications from the security architects to the board
But that measure is there, and a lot of large corporations are doing it.
Well, I think there's an SEC rule now that material risks, including cybersecurity risks, have to get disclosed, and that's just within the last 18 months or so that's come into force. So, I mean, I think that these issues are getting much greater high-level visibility in companies. Plus, they read the same newspapers we do. They don't want to be the next guy, that's in the headlines. So.
Are we at the top of our time?
We have just a few more minutes. I was going to ask if there are other questions. Excellent.
Kind of an easy one. One of the things that we think we've noticed here and there is that if you have an existing system and the auditors have looked at it a few times over and they see no exceptions, whether or not there are any exceptions, that doesn't necessarily get addressed. But when a new system comes in, that becomes the opportunity to address the deficiencies which were already known in the other system and hadn't necessarily exposed themselves to either the auditors or the public. Is that kind of is that kind of a big opportunity point to strengthen security within systems in the way you're seeing things?
Going forward with a new system is always easier than trying to add the brakes after the car's been built, right?
Now that sounds like a separate conversation.
Yeah.
We've got to go over to the Commons and hit the bar over there, and we can talk about that one. All right. Okay, any other final comments or questions? I hope that next year, when we do this conference again, that maybe this can be built into the main body of the conference. Yeah, I hope so. And we need to get this out. So, because I think today people are voting with their feet, and we're seeing, kind of detecting this symptom that maybe security is not, it's important, but it's not my job description, or because I'm a business architect or I'm a data architect or something like that. So hopefully we can bring the issue more front and center. So gentlemen, I'd like to thank you for your leadership on the panel today and participation, and thank you all for coming, and hope you have secure systems now, or more secure systems. Thank you.
Thank you.